So you're probably thinking this guy's not smart at all using a Canon R8 as his main camera on productions. The battery life lasts hardly nothing. The SD card slot, well, it only has one of them. And the overheating issues, probably thinking this guy's an idiot. What is he doing? If you're one of those people thinking that, you would be correct. This is not my main camera. My main camera is the Canon C70, as a lot of you guys know. But in this video, I will go over how this camera holds up on productions. And I'll also go over and tell you a few things that you should buy to build this camera up correctly. So let's start off with a little story. Last week, like I said in my last video, we were in North Carolina. We were shooting a 4-day shoot. 2 of the days were interviews, long interviews, the whole 2 days. The first interview was 2 hours and 30 minutes. You're probably thinking to yourself, this Canon R8 is only advertised for shooting 2 hours straight, which you would be correct. But luckily I was able to change the cards and then it start that 2 hours over, so we were fine. This camera did last the whole 2 hours and 30 minutes in that interview without overheating. I will say we were in an RV, so the sun wasn't baking on it, but we did have to turn the air conditioning off. So it was we were sweating in there. It did not feel good. It was nice and muggy. It was hot in that RV, but it did not have the sun beaming on it. So I will say that, but it did last the whole 2 hours and 30 minutes. It's nice to know if you have to shoot a long interview, you can shoot for 2 hours and 30 minutes as long as the sun is not baking on this camera. Obviously, whenever I had to switch the cards, it may have had a few seconds to cool down just a tad, but I really doubt that helped it at all. But there is that to mention. So keep that in mind as I mentioned that it lasted 2 hours and 30 minutes. So the reason I told you that story is to give you a little bit of perspective on how long this camera can last shooting a long interview at 4K 30 frames per second. Keep in mind, it is shooting at 10-bit log, C-Log 3 at 170 megabits per second. So that is a pretty high bit rate. You're probably asking, how did I shoot that long without needing to change out the batteries every 20 minutes? Because like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, these batteries when you're shooting video only last about 20 minutes. I haven't fully tested it because I never but I do know they do not last long at all. Well, to answer that question, I use an external battery plugged into the USB-C port to make sure the battery never dies. For long interviews, I do not use a dummy battery. I use the regular battery plugged in, and then I plug it into USB-C into an external battery, and literally you could run this camera, if it stays cool enough, you could run it all day long with one battery, which is a battery I mentioned later in the video, but you can run this camera all day long on one battery as long as you're okay with having a cable hooked up. But that's how I was able to do 2 hours and 30 minutes without needing to change out batteries. And the reason why I use a battery inside with a USB-C port instead of just a dummy battery, because if something was to disconnect, maybe you unplug it from the battery in your back pocket on accident, this battery is going to have enough juice for you to realize that and plug it back in so you don't lose the clip that you were just shooting. So there is that protection having this battery in there and doing it the USB-C way, but you do lose a couple of features that I mentioned later in the video. When I'm out shooting on a gimbal with a dummy battery, I usually don't mind shooting it with a dummy battery because I could always get that shot back most of the time. As long as it's not walking and talking or a talking head shot, I could always get that shot back if it's just simple B-roll. Because usually the B-roll that we shoot, most of the time we can just redo it if something weird was to happen, like a cable getting unplugged, or something like that. So that's why I use the batteries on an interview, but not when it's plugged into a gimbal. Honestly, I've never had that happen, but I always think of the worst because the one way to get fired and never rehired is losing someone's footage. Okay, so now that we established that we could shoot 4K 30 long periods of time as long as it's not directly in the sunlight, I want to go over the thing that drives me absolutely crazy if I let it drive me crazy. 4K 60 freaking sucks. When we were in North Carolina, it was a lot better, but it still wasn't the greatest. This thing let us shoot about 4K 60 10-minute clips. Not great, but in Florida, it gets a lot worse. So as I mentioned, I live in Florida and I do a lot of productions on Florida. Yes, I travel a lot, but I do a lot of productions here as well. It's hot in Florida, and so is this camera shooting 4K 60. So before I complain anymore, it shoots 4K 60, 10-bit log, C-Log 3 at 340 megabits per second. So that is pushing a lot of information through this camera with no active cooling. So all this complaining I'm about to do, keep that in mind when it comes to how much data is being pushed through this camera without active cooling. Okay, so another story. A few weeks ago, I was out shooting a fishing show. Not only was it a fishing show, but it was a bass fishing show, so there was no shade to be found anywhere. We were on a boat. It did not have one of those toppers. I forget off the top of my head what it's called, so there was no shade. This camera right here, luckily it was not the main camera or any of the main cameras that we had out there. It was just an extra camera that we were using to shoot if we wanted to. But let me tell you, it let me do 1-minute clips every 15 minutes, it felt like. I had to put an ice pack on this just to cool it down to be able to use it. I will say that it was a very hot day. The Canon C70s were actually throwing up a heat signal as well. Luckily, the Canon C70s never turned off and they never stopped filming, but that gives you an idea of how hot that day was, because the Canon C70s, as you know, has active cooling and it was still throwing up signs. It was just a hot day. But this camera was almost useless that day. We did end up getting a lot of shots with it, but thank God we had an ice pack to put on the back and cool it down. That's the only way we got any type of time with the Canon R8, is by having that ice pack cooling it down and trying our best to keep it out the shade. Throwing a rag over it, something, holding it a certain way so the sun's not hitting it. It's the only way that we got any type of time out of this camera. So with saying all that, I'm not sure if any camera without active cooling would have done any better than the Canon R8 did. So now that we got all that out the way, let's go over how the footage actually looks. As you see in all this footage, it looks great. This camera shoots 4K at a high bit rate, oversampled from 6K. That's why, in my opinion, the footage looks so sharp and so crispy, because it's oversampled from 6K. It's also full frame, so if you put a good lens on here, it's really good in low light as well. So I think in the shooting category, you have nothing to worry about. You just have to remember to not let it overheat, and keep in mind, this is not a long clip camera for 4K 60. Honestly, if you live in a hotter environment, I'm not sure how long it would record at 4K 30. So this camera is definitely not A camera material. I think it will leave you stranded and in a bad situation if you are with a client trying to film any long form content. So as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, there is a few things that you need to purchase to make this thing really awesome, to make it actually usable when you're out in the field shooting. So the first thing you're gonna need is honestly just a USB-C by USB-C cable. This one, I'm not even sure where I got it from, but it's nice and long, so I like it. As you've seen in the clip before, it reaches from my pocket to the camera, nice and long. It's a long USB-C by USB-C. Make sure it's not a cheap cable, because this is your lifeline whenever you're plugged into the Canon R8, so make sure it's not a cheap cable. The next thing you're gonna need is a PD, power delivery power bank. Make sure it throws out constant power. Some of these power banks say they throw out constant power, like the Anchor. It does not. This one from Crave Pro Plus Pro, whatever it is, this one actually throws out constant power. When you plug it into the camera, you never have to worry about the camera shutting off or stop charging. The Anchor that I have, which is right here, let me show it to you. This one will shut off after a few minutes, and I mean, just use your imagination. It will put you in a bad situation. You're recording a clip and then bam, it shuts off just because the battery wants to go to sleep. But this Crave Plus Pro does an amazing job at keeping the battery on, keeping the power on your camera. We've used it a ton and it works every time. And this battery, this big one, it's kind of big, yes, but it lasts all day long. The next thing you're gonna need is a high quality SD card. Do not buy a cheap one. I'm gonna repeat it because I had a story that I'm gonna tell you in a whole second. Don't buy a cheap SD card. When we were in North Carolina, I know a lot of stuff happened on this trip. It usually don't. Usually it goes off without a hitch, nothing to worry about. This trip, a lot of stuff happened that shouldn't have happened. It had nothing to do with my equipment, but it really made me learn some things about my equipment. This trip did. But anyways, that's besides the point. We shot, remember those long interviews I just got done telling you about? We shot all of them on this. And remember, this camera R8 right here only has one slot. Keep that in mind. We went to go dump the footage and it did not want to dump. And one thing that I know from my experience is when an SD card or any type of storage starts acting weird, that's a sign that you have to throw it away and just get a new one. Because when storage starts acting funny, usually when it's about to go out. So luckily we got our data off of it and we were able to put the card away, write bad on it and not use it anymore. But that was the only copy that we had because this only has one SD card slot. My Canon C70, I know I keep bringing it back up, but I shoot 2 SD cards. When I hit record, it's backed up 2 times. Love that. This camera don't have that. So buy a high quality SD card. The ones that I recommend are Kodak and SanDisk. Those are the 2 that I've used for the past 4 or 5 years. They've been great, no complaints. All the other ones I'm not really sure about. The last thing I would recommend is a good dummy battery. The reason I would recommend a good dummy battery and not just use this every time, because when you're using a gimbal, let's say you want to, do it this way, like the way I do it for interviews. You plug it into USB-C, and you charge this the whole time. That's fine, but now your gimbal, you can't plug in the camera to the gimbal to hit start and stop recording. You lose that feature because your port's taken up for charging. But if you use a dummy battery, and most of the time when you're on a gimbal, you're getting shots that you could always get back. Not all the time, but most of the time, so keep that in mind. Sometimes it's just worth it to reach up there and hit record like that, to have your backup having a battery in there. Like I said, with the dummy battery, I've never had anything weird happen, but you just never know. Like I said again, you lose footage, you lose the job, you never get hired again. So that's why I'm thinking the way I'm thinking. Also, one thing that I've noticed with the dummy battery, you take the battery out and you put a dummy battery in there, it takes a little longer for it to overheat and get to that temperature to where it wants to shut off. Actually, it takes a lot longer. You get a lot longer clips with a dummy battery. I'm sure it's only because plugging in, have constant power going in, charging this battery and filming, you know, a lot of friction going on there. Because when you're filming, this battery gets hot and it's charging and it's getting even more hot. So with the dummy battery, all it is a hollow piece of plastic with metal that all it does is provide power to the camera. It's no charging going on. It goes through the cable to the battery, and all your battery heat is going to be within the power bank. It's not going to be within this because there's not a battery in there. I think that's why it lasts longer. I do know that it definitely does last longer with a dummy battery in there. You just have to think about you don't have that protection if you happen to unplug. That's the only negative with that, but I would definitely get a good dummy battery. I do want to mention everything that I mentioned will be down in the description. Buy it there, buy it wherever you want, I don't care, but it is there. So in conclusion, no, this is not my main camera, and no, I do not recommend anybody purchasing this camera as their main camera. It's great for a second interview camera. It's great for a B-roll camera, but to only have this camera on a production will put you in a really bad situation, and you will have a lot of limitations to think about while you're trying to be creative shooting. So with that, make sure you hit the like button, make sure you hit the subscribe button, the bell notification, and I'll see you in the next video.